The rain beat against the towering glass windows of the Vanguard estate with the rhythm of a slow, heavy drum. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was warm smelling of crushed orchids, expensive champagne, and the suffocating weight of extreme wealth. Clara Hayes stood perfectly still behind the shadow of a marble pillar near the eastern exit. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no silk. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, holding a silver tray of fresh crystal glasses. She was not a guest. She was an archivist for the estate, but tonight, like every other employee, she had been drafted into service to ensure the Sterling Vance pre-wedding gala ran without a single flaw. She was supposed to be invisible. For the last 3 years, invisibility had been her armor. Across the room, standing under the blinding light of the central chandelier, was Julian Vance. He was a man composed of sharp angles and cold authority, wearing a tailored midnight blue suit that commanded the attention of every executive and politician in the room. He did not smile often, and he was not smiling now, though he was nodding politely to a senator. Beside him, radiating a practiced flawless warmth, was Vanessa Sterling. Vanessa was wrapped in a gown of spun gold that caught the light with every movement. She was the bride-to-be, the perfect heiress, the woman who had everything Clara had lost. Clara watched Vanessa tip her head back and laugh at something the senator said. The sound was melodic light and entirely hollow. Clara felt a familiar tightness in her throat, a cold knot pulling tight against her chest. She forced herself to breathe slow and measured. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She pressed her fingertips against the cold silver of the tray to ground herself, but the memory was already there, pulling her backward. 3 years ago, Clara had walked through these same halls, not carrying a tray but holding the arm of her husband, Arthur Hayes. Arthur had been the brilliant architect who designed the Vanguard estate's most intricate renovations. He had been a man of integrity, a man who saw structures and foundations for what they truly were. And he had found a structural flaw not in the building but in the financial ledgers managed by the Sterling family. 2 days after Arthur threatened to expose the embezzlement, his car went off the cliff road in the dark. It was ruled a tragic accident. The blueprints and patents he had worked on for a decade were immediately absorbed by the Sterling firm to settle a sudden mysterious debt attached to Arthur's name. Clara was left with nothing. No home, no husband, and a mountain of fabricated legal claims that stripped her of her dignity. Vanessa's father had offered her the low-level archivist position as a cruel charity, keeping her close enough to watch, ensuring she never spoke a word. Clara's knuckles turned white against the edge of the tray. The pain in her chest was a physical thing, a sharp, ragged edge scraping against her ribs. She lowered her gaze to the marble floor, staring at the reflection of the chandelier light. Just endure the night, she told herself. Just survive the night. But Vanessa Sterling had a predator's instinct for weakness. The crowd shifted, parting respectfully as Vanessa glided away from Julian and moved towards the eastern exit. She was flanked by 2 of her bridesmaids women, who mirrored her elegance and her malice. Clara saw them approaching and immediately stepped back, pressing her shoulders closer to the cold marble pillar, making herself as small as possible. It was not enough. Vanessa stopped. She turned her head, slowly, her eyes locking onto Clara. The smile on Vanessa's face did not waver, but her eyes were like shards of dark glass. Clara. Vanessa's voice was smooth, carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. I didn't realize you were serving tonight. I thought you were confined to the basement with the old papers. Clara kept her eyes lowered. The event manager requested all staff on the floor, Miss Sterling. Vanessa took a slow step closer. The scent of her jasmine perfume was overwhelming. She reached out, her fingers glittering with the massive diamond engagement ring Julian had given her, and picked up an empty crystal glass from Clara's tray. She held it up to the light, turning it slowly. It's good for you, Vanessa said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Getting out. Seeing how the world moves on. I always told my father it was a mistake to let you rot in the archives. A woman in your position needs to learn how to serve. After all, Arthur didn't leave you with much of a foundation, did he? The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Her breath stopped. The muscles in her back locked entirely. She stared at the hem of Vanessa's gold dress, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Do not react. Do not let us see it work. One of the bridesmaids let out a soft, cruel giggle. Such a shame about his debts. Vanessa continued, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, meant only for Clara and the few people standing near them. He built all these beautiful walls, but he couldn't keep his own house from collapsing. You must be so grateful to my family for keeping a roof over your head. Clara raised her eyes. For a fraction of a second, the mask of submission slipped. She looked directly into Vanessa's face. It was a look of such absolute devastating clarity that Vanessa's smile faltered for a millimeter. Clara knew the truth. Vanessa knew that Clara knew. But power dictated reality, and Vanessa held all the power. To remind her of this fact, Vanessa casually tilted her hand. The crystal glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. The sound cut through the low hum of the ballroom. Several conversations stopped. Heads turned. Julian Vance, standing 30 feet away, paused mid-sentence and looked over. Oh, Vanessa gasped softly, raising a hand to her chest in a flawless display of surprise. Look what you made me do. You really are clumsy today, Clara. Please clean this up before someone ruins their shoes. It's a very expensive night. Vanessa did not wait for an answer. She turned smoothly, her gold gown sweeping gracefully over the marble, and walked back toward the center of the room, her bridesmaids trailing behind her like shadows. Clara stood frozen. Her ears were ringing. The blood rushed out of her face, leaving her entirely numb. She could feel the eyes of the elite guests resting heavily on her. She heard their murmured whispers, saw the pity and the disdain in their glances. She was a stain on a perfect evening. The tragic widow reduced to sweeping up broken glass at the feet of the woman who stole her life. Slowly, with terrifying mechanical precision, Clara knelt. Her knees touched the cold marble floor. The silk of her cheap black dress pulled around her. She reached out and picked up the largest shard of broken glass. Her fingers trembled so violently that the sharp edge bit into the pad of her thumb. A single drop of blood welled up dark red against the transparent crystal. She did not feel the pain. The fire burning in her chest was so absolute, so consuming, that everything else was reduced to ash. From across the room, Julian Vance watched. His eyes were narrowed slightly. He did not know the archivist's name, but he noticed the way she knelt. It was not the posture of a defeated servant. It was the coiled, terrible stillness of someone holding back a scream. He watched her gather the glass, stand up, and walk silently out of the ballroom, leaving no trace behind except a single microscopic drop of blood on the white stone. Clara moved through the service corridors like a ghost. The noise of the gala faded behind the heavy oak doors, replaced by the deep, resonant silence of the estate's older wing. She did not stop at the kitchens to leave the tray. She kept walking, moving deeper into the shadows of the house, until she reached the heavy iron door of the basement archives. She unlocked it, slipped inside, and shut the door behind her, throwing the deadbolt. The room was vast, lined with towering wooden shelves filled with blueprints, property deeds, and decades of financial history. The air smelled of old paper and dust. It was the only place in the world where Clara felt safe. She walked to the large oak table in the center of the room, set the tray down, and finally let go. Her breath broke into a ragged, tearing gasp. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her entire body shaking. The humiliation was a living thing crawling over her skin. She closed her eyes, and all she could see was Vanessa's smile. All she could hear was the sound of the glass shattering. They won. The thought echoed in the dark. They took his life, they took his name, and they won. She opened her eyes, staring blankly at the stacks of paper on the table. She had been organizing the Sterling firm's recent structural audit's mind-numbing work that required her to cross-reference material deliveries with architectural adjustments. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand, smearing the small drop of blood from her thumb onto the edge of a thick blue folder. She paused. She looked at the folder. It was marked Vanguard, East Wing Renovation Private. Clara frowned. The East Wing had not been renovated in 4 years. Arthur had finished that project before he died. She opened the folder. Inside were not blueprints, but bank transfer receipts, large, systematic transfers moving from Julian Vance's holding company into a series of offshore accounts listed under a shell corporation called Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Clara's breath slowed. The trembling in her hands stopped completely. The coldness returned, spreading through her veins like ice water. She knew that shell corporation. She had seen it 3 years ago. It was the exact same corporate entity that had miraculously paid off Arthur's fabricated debts after his death. It belonged to Vanessa Sterling's brother. Vanessa was not just marrying Julian Vance. She was bleeding his empire dry, before the ink on the marriage certificate was even dry. She was moving millions into her family's offshore accounts, burying the transfers under the guise of fake architectural renovations. She thought no one would ever verify because the only architect who knew the estate's true layout was dead. Clara traced the numbers on the paper. The sum was staggering. Enough to ruin Julian's firm if the market shifted. Enough to put Vanessa in absolute control. Vanessa Sterling thought she was untouchable. She thought she had buried every loose end. She thought the widow in the basement was blind, broken, and stupid. Clara closed the folder. The silence in the archive room was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a weapon being drawn. She stood up perfectly straight. The pain in her chest was gone, replaced by a devastating absolute calm. She was going to burn Vanessa Sterling to the ground. The archive room was completely silent, save for the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the brass clock on the wall. Clara sat at the oak table, her eyes locked on the blue folder. The numbers on the bank transfer receipts blurred and sharpened in her vision. Vanguard Holdings, LLC, the offshore accounts, the fake renovation invoices. Vanessa Sterling was not just a cruel woman, she was a thief. And she was currently draining the empire of the man she was about to marry. Clara slowly closed the folder. She did not feel the frantic, breathless panic she had felt 3 years ago when the lawyers came to take her home. The tears that had choked her back then were gone, burned away by the cold, hard reality of what she was holding. She placed her hands flat on the wooden table. Her pulse was steady. The transition had happened in a matter of minutes. The broken, humiliated widow who had knelt to pick up shattered glass in the ballroom was dead. She stood up and walked to the far end of the archive room, where the oldest architectural blueprints were kept in long steel flat files. She pulled open the third drawer from the bottom. The metal hinges shrieked softly in the quiet room. Arthur used to say that every building had a pulse, a hidden rhythm that only the architect understood. The Vanguard estate was a masterpiece of 19th century stone and modern glass, but it was also a fortress. When Arthur was hired to overhaul the estate's infrastructure, he had spent late nights at their kitchen table, his hands covered in charcoal dust, mapping out the old servant passages and structural hollows. "The Sterlings care about the facade, Clara," he had told her once, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "They want the marble polished and the chandeliers bright. They don't care about the foundation. But if you know the foundation, you own the house." Clara sifted through the thick sheets of vellum until she found the master blueprint for the estate's west wing. It was a section of the house reserved for the Sterling family's private studies and executive offices, strictly off limits to the staff. She unrolled the heavy paper under the yellow light of the desk lamp. Her finger traced the intricate lines of the floor plan, moving past the grand library down the private corridor, and stopping at the wall of the primary executive study. To the untrained eye, it was just a solid load-bearing wall, but Clara had spent 10 years married to a genius. She saw the discrepancy. There was a 6-inch void between the study's mahogany paneling and the stone exterior. It was not a structural necessity, it was a deliberate hollow. Arthur had built a blind vault, and he had never put it on the official blueprints submitted to the city. Clara rolled up the blueprint and left it on the table. She picked up the blue folder of bank transfers, held it against her chest, and walked out of the archives. The gala in the east wing was reaching its peak. She could hear the faint muffled sound of a string quartet echoing through the massive stone corridors. She moved in the opposite direction, slipping through the darkened service hallways with the silent precision of a shadow. She knew the camera blind spots. She knew which floorboards creaked. She had spent 3 years learning how to be invisible, and tonight that invisibility was her greatest weapon. She reached the heavy mahogany doors of the primary executive study. The handle was locked, as expected, but Clara did not need the key. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small flat piece of metal, a tension wrench she had kept from Arthur's old drafting kit. It took her less than 30 seconds to bypass the lock. The door clicked open. Clara slipped inside and closed it silently behind her. The study was pitch black, smelling of aged leather, expensive scotch and floor wax. She did not turn on the lights. She moved by the pale moonlight, filtering through the high windows, walking directly to the far wall lined with towering bookshelves. She ran her fingers over the carved mahogany panels, counting from the left. 1, 2, 3. She stopped at the fourth panel. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, feeling the cold polished surface. She pushed hard, sliding the panel slightly upward and to the right. There was a soft metallic click behind the wood. The panel popped open, revealing a dark steel compartment set directly into the stone. Clara's breath hitched. She reached inside and her fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a heavy, fireproof lockbox. She pulled it out and set it on the large leather desk. The lock was a 4-digit mechanical dial. Clara did not hesitate. She turned the dial to her own wedding anniversary. The lock sprang open with a heavy thud. Clara lifted the lid. The smell of Arthur's pipe tobacco drifted up from the paper, faint, but unmistakable. For a fraction of a second, the iron grip she had on her emotions slipped. A visceral, agonizing wave of grief crashed into her ribs. She gripped the edge of the desk, closing her eyes, forcing the air into her lungs. "Not now," she whispered to the empty room. "Not yet." She opened her eyes and looked down. Inside the box were 3 thick envelopes. She opened the first one. It contained the original patent deeds for the architectural software. Arthur had designed the same patents the Sterlings claimed he had signed over to them before his death. Clara looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a flawless forgery, but attached to it was Arthur's private forensic analysis proving the ink was dated after his supposed transfer. She opened the second envelope. It was a master ledger. Arthur had documented every single embezzlement transaction Vanessa's father had made over a 10-year period. But it was the third envelope that made the blood freeze in Clara's veins. It was a handwritten contract drafted between Vanessa Sterling and a private debt acquisition firm. It outlined the exact strategy used to fabricate Arthur's debts, seize his assets, and legally threaten Clara into silence. It was signed by Vanessa Sterling, and dated 2 days before Arthur's car went off the cliff. Vanessa had not just stolen their money. She had orchestrated the ruin that led to Arthur's death, and she had done it with a casual, devastating arrogance. Clara carefully placed the blue folder she had brought from the archives into the lockbox, laying it on top of Arthur's evidence. She now held the past and the present. She held the proof of the Sterling family's historical crimes and the proof of Vanessa's current betrayal of Julian Vance. It was enough to send Vanessa to federal prison. It was enough to annihilate the Sterling legacy overnight. Clara closed the lockbox. She locked it, picked it up and walked back to the hidden vault in the wall. She slid the box back into the dark stone, snapped the mahogany panel shut, and wiped down the wood with the sleeve of her black dress. The trap was loaded. Now she just needed the right moment to pull the trigger. She turned to leave the study. She had just placed her hand on the brass door handle when she heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. They were slow, deliberate, and stopping directly in front of the door. Clara froze. She stepped back, melting into the shadows beside the heavy velvet curtains, just as the door handle turned. The door swung open. The dim light from the corridor spilled across the Persian rug. Standing in the doorway was Julian Vance. He had taken off his suit jacket and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. He looked exhausted, the sharp angles of his face cast in hard shadow. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, plunging the study back into darkness. He walked toward the desk, clearly seeking refuge from the suffocating social performance of the gala. Clara stood perfectly still against the wall. She did not breathe, but the moonlight caught the edge of her pale face. Julian stopped. His head snapped towards the window. "Who is there?" His voice was low, authoritative, completely devoid of fear. It was the voice of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Clara knew she couldn't hide. Slowly, without a single tremor of panic, she stepped out of the shadows and into the pool of moonlight. Julian's eyes narrowed as they adjusted to the light. He recognized the simple black dress. He recognized the pale face and the dark hair. It was the archivist, the woman who had been humiliated in the ballroom less than an hour ago. "You're the girl from the ballroom," he said. It was not a question. "My name is Clara Hayes, Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It did not shake. It did not hold a trace of the subservience expected of an estate employee. It was smooth cold and entirely equal to his. Julian felt a flicker of surprise. He was a man who read people for a living. When he had watched Vanessa drop the glass in the ballroom, he had seen a broken, fragile woman kneeling on the floor. But the woman standing in front of him now was not broken. She was standing with a spine of absolute steel, her chin parallel to the floor, her eyes dark and unreadable. "This is a restricted wing, Mrs. Hayes," Julian said, taking a slow step toward her. "The staff are not permitted in the executive studies, especially in the dark." "I am an archivist," Clara replied smoothly. "I am responsible for securing the estate's historical documents. The gala caused a disturbance. I was ensuring the West Wing remained undisturbed." It was a perfect lie delivered with zero hesitation. Julian stopped a few feet away from her. The moonlight illuminated the sharp, intelligent assessment in his eyes. "Is that so?" he asked quietly. He looked down. He noticed the small dark smear of dried blood on her thumb. He remembered the shattered crystal glass. "You missed a spot of blood," he said, gesturing to her hand. Clara looked down at her thumb. She did not try to hide it. She looked back up at Julian, her expression completely flat. "It stopped bleeding," she said simply. Julian stared at her. Most people shifted under his gaze. They over-explained, they fidgeted. They tried to fill the silence. Clara did none of those things. She held his stare with a devastating calm that bordered on arrogance. She looked at the billionaire standing in front of her as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the room. "Vanessa was harsh with you," Julian noted, watching her face carefully for a reaction. "She has a temper when she is stressed." "Miss Sterling was precisely who she always is," Clara said. The edge in her voice was so subtle, so exquisitely sharp, that Julian almost missed it. It wasn't the petty resentment of a mistreated servant. It was the cold, objective judgment of an executioner. Julian took another step closer. The air between them suddenly felt charged heavy with an unspoken tension. He realized, with a strange jolt of clarity, that he was intensely curious about the woman in the black dress. "Who are you really, Clara Hayes?" he asked, his voice dropping in volume. Clara looked at the man Vanessa Sterling was planning to ruin. He was powerful, brilliant, and completely blind to the knife resting against his throat. "I am the widow of Arthur Hayes," Clara said softly, the name ringing in the quiet room like a bell. "The man who built the walls you are standing inside, and I am the only person in this house who is not lying to you tonight." Before Julian could process the weight of those words, Clara stepped past him. She moved with effortless grace, opening the study door and slipping out into the corridor. Julian turned, but the door clicked shut. She was gone. He stood alone in the dark study, the silence of the room suddenly feeling entirely different. He looked at the spot where she had been standing. The widow of Arthur Hayes. He knew the name. He knew the tragic story of the architect's death and the debt that followed. But the woman he had just spoken to was not a victim. She was a loaded gun, and Julian Vance suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that someone was about to pull the trigger. 3 days had passed since the gala. The Vanguard estate was consumed by the frantic machinery of the approaching wedding. Florists carried towering arrangements of white hydrangeas through the main halls. Caterers argued over menu placements and champagne vintages. The air was thick with the exhausting performance of high society preparing for its crowning event. But inside Julian Vance's private office, the atmosphere was dead cold and entirely still. Julian sat behind his massive obsidian desk staring at a single sheet of paper. It was not a wedding invitation. It was a background check. For 72 hours, the words of the widow had echoed in the back of his mind, with the persistent, irritating rhythm of a metronome. "I am the only person in this house who is not lying to you tonight." Julian was a man who traded in information, did not build a multi-billion-dollar empire by ignoring anomalies. Clara Hayes was an anomaly. She possessed a stillness that did not belong to a defeated servant. So he had ordered his private intelligence team to quietly pull the files on Arthur Hayes. The results were entirely too clean. A man dies, leaves behind a mountain of sudden debt. His revolutionary patents are immediately absorbed by his employer, and his wife is relegated to the basement. The legal documents were flawless, too flawless. They lacked the messy friction of reality. Someone had sanitized the narrative. Julian looked at the second item on his desk. It was a small, thick white card of premium cardstock. He had found it resting precisely in the center of his keyboard when he returned from a board meeting an hour ago. Written on it in elegant, sharp black ink was a single line: The library, midnight. Bring the Sterling audit files. No signature, none was needed. The Vanguard Library was a cavernous room built of dark mahogany and emerald green velvet. At midnight, it was a tomb of silence. The heavy double doors shut behind Julian with a solid absolute thud, cutting off the faint sounds of the night staff patrolling the lower floors. He walked down the central aisle, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. He held a leather binder under his left arm. She was waiting for him at the far end of the room, standing beside a massive antique globe. Clara Hayes wore a tailored black coat over a dark dress. Her posture was perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly at her sides. The soft yellow light from a single reading lamp illuminated the sharp, elegant lines of her face. She did not look like an archivist. She did not look like a woman who had been publicly humiliated just days prior. She looked like a queen, waiting for a subordinate to approach. "You are punctual," Clara said. Her voice was smooth, cutting through the heavy silence without a single tremor. Julian stopped on the opposite side of the heavy, wooden reading table. He placed the leather binder on the polished surface. "You left a note on my desk," Julian said, his voice low, testing the boundaries of the room. "My security detail monitors the executive suite 24 hours a day, yet no one saw you enter. No one saw you leave." "I know the blind spots," Clara replied evenly. "A foundation is only as secure as the architect who built it. My husband built yours." Julian watched her carefully. He was accustomed to women who softened themselves in his presence. Vanessa constantly calibrated her tone to ensure she appeared agreeable, charming, and unthreatening. Clara Hayes made absolutely no effort to accommodate him. Her presence was cold, dense, and completely unyielding. "You told me you were the only one not lying to me," Julian said. He leaned forward, slightly, resting his hands on the back of a leather chair. "I pulled the records on your husband. The debts were verified by 3 independent banks." Clara did not blink. A lie told by 3 different banks is still a lie, Mr. Vance. It just means the person paying for the lie has deep pockets. She stepped forward and reached into her black coat. She withdrew a single crisp manila folder. She placed it on the mahogany table and slid it slowly across the wood until it stopped exactly 2 inches from Julian's hands. "Open it," she commanded. It was not a request. Julian felt a strange, sharp thrill of tension. He was not used to taking orders, least of all from an employee. He picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside were copies of the documents Clara had extracted from the hidden vault. The offshore account transfers, the shell corporations, the fake invoices for the East Wing renovations. Julian's eyes scanned the pages. His intellect was a machine designed to process complex financial structures in seconds. It did not take him long to see the architecture of the fraud. The numbers aligned perfectly with the gaps in the Sterling audit files he had brought with him. "Vanguard Holdings, LLC," Clara said, her voice echoing softly in the vast room. "Registered in the Cayman Islands. Controlled by Vanessa Sterling's brother. For the past 6 months, your fiancée has been systematically bleeding your private holding company. She creates fake structural issues in the estate, requests funds for urgent renovations, and funnels the capital directly into her family's offshore accounts." Julian stared at the papers. The muscles in his jaw tightened. A cold absolute fury began to spread through his chest. He was Julian Vance. Men feared him. Competitors broke under his gaze. And yet, the woman he shared his bed with, the woman who smiled perfectly for the cameras and adjusted his tie before board meetings, had been quietly stealing millions from him. "She thinks you are a fool," Clara said, smoothly twisting the blade with clinical precision. "She thinks your arrogance blinds you to the details. She assumes you will never look past the perfect facade she presents." Julian snapped the folder shut. He looked up at Clara. His eyes were like glacial ice. "These are copies," he stated. "Where are the originals?" Secured, Clara replied, without missing a beat. "You understand what happens if I hand this to my attorneys tomorrow morning?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The Sterling family will be investigated. The wedding will be cancelled. Vanessa will face federal charges before the week is over." Clara's expression did not change. Her breathing remained perfectly controlled. "You will not hand this to your attorneys tomorrow morning," Clara said. Julian raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" "Because cancelling a wedding and filing a quiet lawsuit is a businessman's revenge," Clara said, taking a slow step around the table. "It is neat. It is clinical. It allows Vanessa to play the victim. She will spin the narrative to the press. She will claim you broke her heart and framed her to protect your assets. Her family will bury the evidence in endless litigation. She will walk away, with her social standing bruised but entirely intact. She stopped a few feet away from him. The scent of rain and cold night air clung to her coat, a sharp contrast to the stale, expensive air of the estate. "I do not want her bruised," Clara said. Her voice dropped an octave, carrying a heavy, devastating weight that made the air in the room feel thin. "I want her ruined." Julian stared into her dark eyes. He saw the absolute terrifying void of her grief compressed and refined into a weapon of pure logic. There was no hysteria here, only the calculated patience of a predator. 3 years ago, Clara continued maintaining eye contact. Vanessa Sterling forged documents to steal my husband's patents. When he discovered the fraud and threatened to expose her family's embezzlement, he died in a tragic accident. She took my home. She took his name. She put me in a basement and paraded around in gold dresses bought with my husband's blood. Clara tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing right through him. "You want your money back, Mr. Vance, but I want her soul." The silence in the library was deafening. Julian felt the ground shifting beneath him. He was looking at a woman who had been stripped of everything, completely cast out from the world of power and privilege. Yet standing in this dark room, she held more power than anyone he had ever met. She was orchestrating a symphony of destruction, and she was handing him the baton. Julian slowly walked around the chair, stepping closer to her. He towered over her deliberately, using his physical size to test her nerve. Most people stepped back instinctively. Clara did not move a fraction of an inch. She held her ground, her spine straight. Her gaze locked on his with an intensity that burned. "If we do not go to the lawyers tomorrow," Julian said softly, "what exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Hayes?" Clara looked up at him. "I am proposing a partnership. You will continue with the wedding preparations. You will smile for the cameras. You will sign the preliminary marriage contracts. You will let Vanessa Sterling put on her perfect white dress and walk down the aisle in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the country. You will let her believe she has won everything." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy between them. "And when the priest asks if anyone objects," Clara said, her voice turning to ice, "I will walk through the doors. I will hand you the original documents in front of the entire elite class. You will reject her at the altar. You will expose her crimes to the people whose opinions she values more than her own life. We will not just take her freedom. We will take her dignity, her status, and her name. We will burn her world to the ground while everyone she knows watches." Julian felt a dark, visceral satisfaction uncoiling in his chest. It was a flawless strategy. It was brutal, theatrical, and utterly devastating. It was exactly the kind of destruction Vanessa Sterling deserved for daring to play him for a fool. He looked at the woman standing before him, the poor, humiliated widow who had been forced to kneel and pick up broken glass. She was not a victim. She was the architect of a masterpiece. "And what do you want from me in return?" Julian asked. Clara's eyes were completely steady. "I want Arthur's patents returned to my name. I want a public statement from Vanguard Estate acknowledging his true contributions. And I want the Sterling firm liquidated to pay the restitution. I want my husband's legacy scrubbed clean of their filth." Julian nodded slowly. "A steep price." "It is the exact cost of the truth," Clara replied. Julian reached out and picked up the manila folder. He held it in his left hand, the physical weight of Vanessa's betrayal resting against his palm. He looked back at Clara. The alliance was unnatural, the billionaire and the cast-out widow. But in that room, they were the only two people who understood the true nature of the game they were playing. "We have an agreement, Clara Hayes," Julian said. Clara did not smile. She did not offer her hand to shake. She simply gave a single elegant nod of her head. "Do not let her see you change," Clara advised, turning toward the shadows of the library. "Vanessa is arrogant, but she is not stupid. Play the devoted groom. Let her arrogance blind her completely." Julian watched her walk away, the sharp clicks of her heels echoing cleanly against the stone floor. She paused at the heavy double doors, looking back over her shoulder. The dim light caught the fierce, unyielding architecture of her profile. "Enjoy your final days as a blind man, Mr. Vance," Clara said quietly. "Because on Saturday we open everyone's eyes." The doors closed behind her with a soft click. Julian stood alone in the vast library. He looked down at the folder in his hand, then walked over to the globe. He spun it slowly with one finger. A genuine dangerous smile finally broke across his face. Vanessa Sterling thought she was the untouchable queen of the board. She had absolutely no idea the game was already over. The final 48 hours before the Sterling-Vance wedding descended upon the Vanguard estate with a suffocating gilded intensity. The entire property had been transformed into a monument to elite privilege. White silk draped from the vaulted ceilings imported white roses, choked the grand staircases, and a small army of staff moved frantically to polish silver that was already gleaming. Julian Vance sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table in the morning room, bathed in the pale cold light of an overcast Thursday. Before him rested the final revised prenuptial agreements and the estate transfer contracts. Across the table sat Vanessa Sterling. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater and a delicate string of pearls, sipping her morning tea with the absolute serenity of a woman who believed she had conquered the world. Julian picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. He unhooked the cap with a soft metallic click. "My lawyers reviewed the final addendums your father requested," Julian said, his voice a smooth, flat baritone that betrayed absolutely nothing. "The transfer of the Vanguard holding accounts into the joint trust will be initiated the moment we sign the marriage registry on Saturday." Vanessa lowered her teacup. Her dark eyes gleamed with a hunger she could barely conceal. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers resting gently over his wrist. "It is only a formality, Julian," she said, her voice dripping with practiced affection. "My father simply wants to ensure that our families are fully integrated. We are building a legacy together. I want everything to be perfect." Julian looked at her hand resting on his wrist. He felt the cold, heavy weight of her diamond engagement ring. 3 days ago, he would have looked at this woman and seen a fiercely intelligent, devoted partner. Today, he looked at her and saw a parasite methodically chewing through the foundation of his life's work. He remembered the dark library. He remembered the crisp manila folder Clara Hayes had slid across the table, filled with the irrefutable evidence of Vanessa's embezzlement. He remembered the cold, dead certainty in Clara's voice when she told him exactly how they were going to destroy this woman. "Do not let her see you change," Clara's instruction echoed in his mind. Julian offered Vanessa a slow, measured smile. It was a flawless imitation of devotion. "It will be perfect," Julian said softly. He pressed the nib of his pen to the thick parchment and signed his name on the preliminary disclosures. Vanessa's smile widened, sharp and victorious. She had done it. She had secured the Vanguard empire. The millions she had already funneled into her brother's offshore accounts were completely safe, buried under the incoming flood of joint assets. She felt untouchable. She felt like a god. But as she looked out the tall windows toward the sprawling lawns of the estate, a single irritating thought crossed her mind. A minor smudge on her immaculate canvas. Clara Hayes, the widow in the basement. The ghost of Arthur Hayes. Vanessa hated the way Clara had looked at her in the ballroom 3 nights ago. She hated the terrible, unyielding stillness in the woman's eyes. It was not the look of a defeated servant. It was a look of quiet judgment. Vanessa Sterling did not tolerate judgment from the people she had broken. She decided right then that Clara Hayes would not be in the house when she returned from her honeymoon. In fact, Clara Hayes would not be in the house by sunset. 2 hours later, the heavy iron door of the basement archives swung open with a sharp, violent creak. Clara was standing beside the long oak table. She was not reviewing blueprints or organizing files. She was carefully folding a faded grey wool sweater and placing it into a small worn leather suitcase. It was Arthur's sweater. It was one of the few things she had managed to save from their old life. She did not look up when the door opened. The scent of jasmine perfume and expensive leather announced Vanessa's arrival seconds before her heels clicked against the concrete floor. "Packing already, Clara?" Vanessa asked, her voice echoing in the cold, cavernous room. "How remarkably intuitive of you." Clara slowly placed a stack of Arthur's old drafting pencils into the suitcase. She closed the lid and snapped the brass latches shut. Only then did she turn to face the bride. Vanessa stood in the center of the archive room, flanked by her 2 loyal bridesmaids. They looked around the dusty, windowless room with expressions of exaggerated disgust, holding their hands over their noses, as if the very air of poverty was contagious. Vanessa held a crisp white envelope in her gloved hand. "I am streamlining the estate staff before the wedding," Vanessa said, stepping forward. Her tone was brisk, corporate, and entirely devoid of human empathy. "My father and I have reviewed the payroll. The position of archivist is redundant. The Vanguard estate no longer requires your services." She tossed the white envelope onto the oak table. It landed with a soft, dismissive slap. "That is your final severance." Vanessa continued, a cruel smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It includes 2 weeks of standard pay and a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding your time working for my family. You have 1 hour to clear your personal belongings and vacate the premises." Clara looked at the envelope. Then she looked up at Vanessa. There was no shock. There were no tears. There was not even a flicker of anger. Clara's face was a mask of devastating absolute calm. The complete lack of emotional reaction unnerved Vanessa more than screaming or begging ever could. "I see," Clara said quietly. Her voice was steady, the syllables clipped and precise. "Do you—" Vanessa stepped closer, her frustration spiking at Clara's refusal to break. She wanted to see the widow cry. She wanted to see her shatter. "Because you look confused, Clara. Let me make it very clear. You don't belong here. You never did. Arthur was a hired hand who didn't know his place, and you are just the pathetic mess he left behind. I will not have you dragging your miserable history through my home." One of the bridesmaids scoffed softly, a jagged little sound of amusement. Clara did not look at the bridesmaid. She kept her dark, bottomless eyes locked firmly on Vanessa. She noted the arrogant tilt of Vanessa's chin, the flush of victory on her cheeks, the massive diamond glittering on her finger. Vanessa was standing on a trapdoor with a noose around her neck, completely unaware that Clara held the lever. "Your home?" Clara repeated softly. The words lacked any trace of sarcasm. They were stated as a simple, objective fact. "Yes, mine," Vanessa hissed, leaning in closer. "And when I walk down that aisle on Saturday, everything your husband ever touched will belong entirely to me. So take your little suitcase, Clara, and walk out the back door. If you are still on the grounds by noon, I will have security throw you out." Clara held Vanessa's gaze for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the archive room stretched tight, vibrating with an invisible, lethal tension. Then Clara reached out and picked up her worn leather suitcase. She did not touch the severance envelope. She left it sitting on the table. "I am leaving Miss Sterling," Clara said. Her voice dropped, becoming frighteningly soft, cutting through the dusty air like a scalpel. "But you should know that I never exit through the back door." Before Vanessa could process the strange, cold threat hidden in those words, Clara stepped past her. She did not flinch. She did not lower her head. She walked with her spine perfectly straight, her black dress moving like a shadow against the dim light of the basement. Vanessa turned, staring at Clara's retreating back, a sudden, inexplicable shiver running down her spine. She shook it off immediately. It was just the pathetic bravado of a ruined woman. Clara walked up the service stairs, her steps steady and rhythmic. She pushed open the heavy door leading to the main floor. The light of the grand foyer hit her eyes bright and unforgiving. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, blinding glow over the white marble floors. Dozens of caterers, florists, and estate staff were moving through the hall. As Clara walked into the center of the foyer, dragging her single scuffed suitcase behind her, the movement in the room began to slow. The visual contrast was jarring. The dark, simple figure of the widow moving through a sea of white silk and white roses. Vanessa and her bridesmaids appeared at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the spectacle. They stood against the ornate marble railing, like royalty, watching a peasant being exiled. "Look at her!" One of the bridesmaids whispered loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the echoing hall. "Like a stray dog finally getting kicked out into the rain." A few of the estate staff looked away, pity and discomfort etched on their faces. But Clara did not stop. She did not bow her head to hide from their stares. She walked directly across the center of the grand foyer, the wheels of her suitcase clicking sharply against the marble. The sound was loud, precise, and entirely unapologetic. She reached the massive, heavy oak front doors, the main entrance. The entrance reserved strictly for the Vanguard family and their elite guests. A security guard stepped forward instinctively to redirect her to the service exit, but Clara turned her head and leveled a look of such freezing, commanding authority at him that the man actually stopped in his tracks, his mouth slightly open. Clara reached out, gripped the heavy brass handle, and pulled the grand door open. The cold, sharp wind from the coast rushed into the warm foyer, carrying the smell of salt and incoming rain. She paused on the threshold. Slowly, deliberately, Clara turned around. She looked up at the grand staircase. She looked directly at Vanessa Sterling, who was standing high above, smirking in her white cashmere. Clara did not speak. She simply offered a smile. It was not a smile of defeat. It was a tiny, razor-sharp smile of pure, lethal anticipation. It was the smile of the architect who had just locked the doors to the burning building. Vanessa's smirk vanished. For a split second, a cold spike of genuine panic pierced her chest, though she had no idea why. Clara turned her back to the staircase, walked out into the cold grey morning, and let the heavy oak door slam shut behind her with a sound like a gunshot. High above the foyer, standing in the shadows of the second-floor executive gallery, Julian Vance watched the entire scene unfold. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting in the pockets of his dark trousers. He had watched Vanessa gloat. He had watched the bridesmaids laugh. And he had watched Clara Hayes walk across the marble floor like she owned the very foundation of the earth beneath her feet. He watched through the massive front window as Clara walked down the long, sweeping gravel driveway. The wind whipped her black coat around her legs, but her pace never slowed, never faltered. She carried nothing but one suitcase and the absolute irrefutable truth. Julian looked down at the grand staircase. Vanessa was already turning back to her friends, laughing, ordering a servant to bring them champagne to celebrate the house cleaning. She was celebrating her absolute victory. She believed she had removed the final threat. She believed she had buried the ghost of Arthur Hayes forever. Julian felt a slow, dangerous rhythm beating in his chest. The trap was now fully armed. The guillotine had been hauled to the very top of its track, the rope pulled tight, waiting for the precise moment to drop. He turned away from the window and walked back into the shadows of his office, his face hardening into stone. "Enjoy your champagne, Vanessa," Julian whispered to the empty room. "It is the last drink you will ever have in this house." The Vanguard estate had been transformed into a cathedral of white and gold. Saturday afternoon arrived with a brilliant, piercing blue sky, the kind of weather that money seemed to buy for the elite. The ceremony was taking place in the Grand Conservatory, a towering glass and steel pavilion built directly into the cliffside overlooking the crushing grey waves of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture. It was also the final crowning achievement designed by Arthur Hayes before his death. The cruel irony of the Sterling family claiming this space to celebrate their ultimate victory was not lost on the 300 guests taking their seats, though none would ever speak of it aloud. In this world, power erased history. The air inside the conservatory was heavily perfumed with thousands of imported white orchids. A string quartet played a slow, elegant piece by Vivaldi, the music weaving through the low, wealthy murmur of senators, tech billionaires, and media tycoons. They wore bespoke suits and designer gowns a sea of diamonds and silk, completely unaware that they were sitting inside a bomb waiting to detonate. At the far end of the conservatory, standing on a raised marble dais beneath a breathtaking arch of white roses, was Julian Vance. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit him with lethal perfection. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. To the hundreds of guests watching him, he looked like the ultimate titan of industry, waiting to claim his beautiful bride. He looked commanding, composed, and entirely victorious. In reality, his heart beat with the slow, freezing rhythm of a sniper adjusting his scope. Julian looked out over the crowd. In the front row sat Richard Sterling, Vanessa's father. The older man was beaming, his chest puffed out with sheer, unadulterated arrogance. He caught Julian's eye and offered a slow, satisfied nod. It was the nod of a man who believed he had just successfully swallowed the Vanguard empire whole. Julian returned the nod with a faint, perfectly calibrated smile. His eyes moved past Richard, scanning the heavy oak double doors at the far end of the central aisle. The doors were currently closed, guarded by 2 private security men. Just endure the march, Julian told himself. Let her walk all the way to the end of the plank. The string quartet seamlessly transitioned into the wedding march. The deep resonant notes of a cello rolled through the glass pavilion. The low murmur of the crowd vanished instantly. 300 guests stood up in absolute unison, turning their heads towards the back of the room. The heavy oak doors slowly pulled open. Vanessa Sterling stood at the threshold. She was a vision of staggering manufactured perfection. Her gown was a masterpiece of French lace and spun white silk clinging to her figure before trailing behind her in a dramatic, sweeping train. A sheer veil covered her face, anchored by a diamond tiara that caught the sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling, shattering the light into tiny rainbows across the marble floor. She gripped her father's arm. Richard Sterling looked at his daughter with a pride that was entirely rooted in greed. They stepped forward in unison, beginning the long walk down the white runner. Beneath the veil, Vanessa's heart was hammering with wild, intoxicating triumph. She looked straight ahead at Julian standing on the marble dais. He was handsome. He was unimaginably wealthy, and he was completely hers to drain. As she walked past the rows of adoring, envious guests, her mind raced through the checklist of her victories. The offshore accounts were completely loaded. The marriage registry was sitting on a silver table to the left of the altar, waiting for their signatures to merge the Vanguard and Sterling assets permanently. And the final piece of trash, Clara Hayes, had been swept out into the rain 2 days ago. There were no loose ends. There were no ghosts left to haunt her. She was stepping into the role of the most powerful woman in the state, and no one could touch her. Julian watched her float toward him. He noted the graceful sway of her hips, the perfect tilt of her chin, the delicate grip of her gloved hand on her father's arm. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. If Clara Hayes had not walked into his study on Wednesday night, Julian knew he would have married this woman. He would have handed her the keys to his kingdom and let her carve it hollow from the inside out. The thought sent a spike of pure violent ice through his veins, but his face remained a mask of devoted stoicism. Vanessa and her father reached the end of the aisle. Richard Sterling turned to Julian, offering his daughter's hand with a theatrical gesture of blessing. Julian reached out and took Vanessa's hand. Her skin was warm through the silk of her glove. She stepped up onto the marble dais beside him, handing her bouquet of white orchids to her maid of honor. She turned to face Julian, lifting her veil back over her tiara. Her dark eyes were shining with what looks like tears of joy. Julian looked down at her. "You look beautiful, Vanessa," he said softly, his voice carrying perfectly over the microphone clipped to the priest's robes. "I have waited my whole life for this moment," Vanessa whispered back, her voice trembling with perfect practiced emotion. The priest, an older man with a gentle face, stepped up to the podium. He raised his hands, gesturing for the 300 guests to be seated. The rustle of silk and the soft thud of expensive leather shoes echoed through the conservatory as the elite crowd settled in to witness the union of 2 dynasties. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing off the high glass walls. "We are gathered here today in this magnificent hall to join Julian Vance and Vanessa Sterling in the holy bond of matrimony, a bond built on mutual trust, unyielding honesty, and a foundation of absolute truth." Julian felt a bitter, sharp amusement at the priest's choice of words. A foundation of absolute truth. He allowed his eyes to drift towards the massive glass windows, looking out at the crashing grey waves of the ocean. The trap was armed. The timer was counting down the final seconds. The priest continued through the standard invocations, speaking of loyalty and the sacred merging of 2 lives. Vanessa stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on Julian, radiating absolute devotion. She was completely submerged in her own illusion. "Julian," the priest said, turning to him, "do you take Vanessa to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold from this day forward, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health to love, and to cherish until death do you part?" The conservatory was dead silent. The only sound was the faint rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffs outside. 300 people held their breath, waiting for the billionaire to say the 2 words that would shift the balance of power in the financial world. Julian looked at Vanessa. He saw the greedy, starving anticipation hidden just behind her beautiful smile. He saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. She had won. Julian let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Vanessa's smile faltered by a fraction of a millimeter. A tiny furrow appeared between her perfect brows. The guests shifted slightly in their seats. The silence was suddenly stretching too long. It was turning heavy. It was turning wrong. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but he did not say the words. Instead, a sound ripped through the breathless silence of the conservatory. It was a loud, sharp, metallic crack. It was the sound of the heavy iron latches on the grand double doors being thrown open. Every head in the room, all 300 guests, snapped backward. Vanessa gasped, her head jerking around toward the entrance. The string quartet, waiting to play the triumphant exit march, froze with their bows hovering over their strings. The heavy oak doors at the back of the central aisle did not just open. They were pushed apart with a solid echoing force that sent a tremor through the marble floor. The sunlight from the foyer poured into the dark corridor. and stepping out of the blinding light crossing the threshold of the Grand Conservatory was Clara Hayes. The collective intake of breath from the elite crowd was audible. A low, shocked wave of whispers instantly broke out. No one recognized the woman in the basement. They did not recognize the broken widow in the cheap faded clothes who had knelt on the floor 3 days ago to clean up shattered glass. The woman standing at the end of the white runner was a terrifying, breathtaking vision of cold elegance. Clara was not wearing rags. She wore a tailored, floor-length black gown that absorbed the light, its sharp, asymmetric lines cutting a striking silhouette against the sea of white roses and pastel bridesmaid dresses. Her dark hair was swept back flawlessly, exposing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw and cheekbones. She wore no jewelry. She carried no purse. She needed absolutely nothing to announce her power. Her presence alone sucked the oxygen entirely out of the massive room. In her right hand, she held a thick, dark leather binder. Vanessa Sterling stood at the altar, her face draining of all color. The blood rushed out of her head so fast she felt the room tilt. Her hands began to tremble violently. She recognized the face. She recognized the dark, bottomless eyes. But this was impossible. She had thrown this woman out. She had crushed her. "Security!" Richard Sterling hissed from the front row, half rising from his chair, his face flushing purple with outrage. Security removed that woman immediately. 2 large men in dark suits stepped quickly from the shadows near the entrance, reaching their hands out to grab Clara's arms. "Let her pass!" A voice cut through the room like a crack of thunder. The security men froze. The entire room turned back to the altar. Julian Vance had stepped away from Vanessa. He was standing at the edge of the marble dais, his voice amplified by the microphone, his face carved from glacial ice. "I said," Julian repeated, his eyes locking onto the guards, "let her pass. Anyone who touches her will answer directly to me." The guards immediately stepped back, lowering their heads. Vanessa stared at Julian, her mouth opening, but no sound coming out. A cold, suffocating dread began to wrap its fingers around her throat. She looked from Julian back down the long white aisle to the woman in black. Clara Hayes did not run. She did not shout. She began to walk down the central aisle, her sharp black heels clicking against the pristine white marble with a slow, devastating metronomic rhythm. Click, click, click. Every step was a hammer striking the foundation of the Sterling Empire. The guests parted instinctively, leaning away from her as if she were a physical manifestation of a storm. They watched in terrified, absolutely mesmerized silence as the woman in black walked straight through the heart of the elite world. Clara kept her eyes locked entirely on the altar. She did not look at the billionaires or the senators. She did not look at Richard Sterling, who was now shaking with visible panic. She looked straight at Vanessa. Vanessa's breathing turned ragged. She gripped the edge of the priest's podium to keep her legs from collapsing. The illusion was breaking. The perfect world she had built was cracking open right under her feet. Clara reached the end of the aisle. She stopped at the base of the marble dais exactly 3 feet away from the bride. The contrast was cinematic. The arrogant heiress in her millions of dollars of white lace trembling and terrified, and the cast-out widow in simple black standing with the unyielding stillness of a monument. The priest stepped back, clutching his Bible, completely paralyzed. Clara slowly lifted her chin. She looked at Vanessa, her dark eyes completely dead, completely empty of mercy. Then she turned her gaze to Julian. "Mr. Vance," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the glass ceiling carried it to every single corner of the silent room. It was smooth cold and razor sharp. "You asked for the foundation records of this estate before you signed the registry." She raised the dark leather binder and held it out. "I brought the true blueprints," Clara said, "and the receipts." The wedding march was over. The execution was about to begin. Julian Vance stepped down from the raised marble dais. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate grace of a predator, closing in on a trapped target. He stopped directly in front of Clara Hayes, standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman in black, turning his back entirely on his bride. He reached out and took the dark leather binder from Clara's hands. The silence in the Grand Conservatory was absolute. 300 of the most powerful people in the country were completely paralyzed, holding their breath, as Julian slowly opened the cover. The crisp sound of the heavy parchment turning echoed through the microphone clipped to his lapel, sounding like the sharp crack of a whip in the vast, vaulted room. Julian looked down at the documents, the offshore transfer ledgers, the fake architectural invoices, the forged patent deeds. And finally, the contract signed by Vanessa Sterling, detailing the exact mechanics of Arthur Hayes' financial ruin. Julian lifted his head, his eyes cold and entirely devoid of mercy, swept over the frozen crowd, before locking onto Richard Sterling in the front row. 3 days ago, Julian's voice rang out deep level and carrying a lethal resonance that made the glass walls seem to vibrate. My fiancé's father presented me with the final addendums to our marriage contract. He spoke of legacy. He spoke of the seamless integration of the Vanguard and Sterling empires. He assured me that his daughter was the perfect partner to safeguard my life's work. Julian paused, holding up a single piece of paper from the binder. What Richard Sterling failed to mention, Julian continued, the temperature in the room plummeting with every word, was the existence of Vanguard Holdings, LLC, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands controlled entirely by his son. Over the past 6 months, millions of dollars have been systematically siphoned from my private accounts into this offshore entity disguised as structural renovations for this very estate. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. The quiet murmurs of the elite instantly dissolved into genuine, horrified shock. Billionaires exchanged alarmed glances. Senators shifted uncomfortably. "That is a lie!" Richard Sterling shouted, leaping from his chair. His face was a mask of sheer panic, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk collar. "This isn't outrage, Julian. You cannot possibly believe the forged garbage of a bitter, deranged former employee." "Sit down, Richard," Julian commanded. It was not a request. It was an executioner's final order. 4 members of Julian's private security detail instantly stepped out from the shadows of the floral arches, moving to surround Richard Sterling. The older man froze, the bluster draining from his face, leaving behind the pale, sickly realization of a man who suddenly understands he is going to prison. He sank slowly back into his chair. Julian turned back to the altar. He looked up at Vanessa. She was trembling so violently that the diamonds in her tiara rattled against her hair. The perfect, arrogant facade was entirely gone. Her eyes were wide, filled with a primal, suffocating terror. She opened her mouth, a desperate, broken sound escaping her lips. "Julian, please," Vanessa whispered, her voice cracking, pleading for the microphone not to pick up her humiliation. "Please don't do this. I love you. It's a misunderstanding. She hates me. She fabricated all of this because she is jealous." Julian looked at her with an expression of absolute disgust. He stepped back onto the dais, closing the distance between them, and held up a second piece of paper. It was written in Vanessa's own elegant handwriting. "This is not just about the money, Vanessa," Julian said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, devastating fury. "If you were simply a thief, I would hand you to the federal authorities and be done with you. But you are far worse than a thief." He turned his body slightly, ensuring the entire audience could hear the death blow. 3 years ago, the true architect of this estate, Arthur Hayes, discovered your family's embezzlement, Julian announced. Instead of stepping down, you fabricated debts in his name. You forged his signature to steal his revolutionary patents. And 2 days after he threatened to expose you, his car was forced off the cliff road. You took his life. You stole his legacy. And then, with breathtaking cruelty, you forced his grieving widow into your basement to serve you. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was a suffocating, heavy vacuum. The guests stared at Vanessa Sterling, not with envy, but with absolute revulsion. She was no longer the golden heiress of high society. She was a monster, stripped bare under the blinding light of the chandeliers. "No!" Vanessa sobbed, the tears finally spilling over, streaking her flawless makeup. She reached out, her hands desperately clawing at Julian's tuxedo jacket. "Julian, please! You have to listen to me. I did it for us. I wanted to secure our future." Julian did not flinch. He did not step away. He simply looked down at her hands, gripping his coat. "Take your hands off me," Julian said. The words were spoken with such freezing, absolute contempt that Vanessa physically recoiled as if she had been burned. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the hem of her $1,000,000 French lace gown. She lost her balance and collapsed onto the marble floor. The bride who had mocked the poor widow's poverty just 48 hours ago was now on her knees, in front of 300 people weeping uncontrollably, her silk train tangled around her legs like a shroud. "The wedding is cancelled," Julian declared, speaking directly to the crowd. He did not look down at Vanessa again. "My legal team is currently filing the necessary documents with the federal prosecutor's office. The Sterling firm's assets will be frozen by midnight. Furthermore, I am officially returning all stolen patents and the accompanying royalties to their rightful owner." Julian turned from the podium and looked at the woman in the black dress. Clara Hayes stood at the base of the dais entirely motionless. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She did not look at the weeping woman on the floor. Clara looked at Julian. For a fraction of a second, an unspoken exchange passed between them. The contract was fulfilled. The debt of blood and dignity was paid in full. Clara felt a profound physical shift within her body, the crushing weight that had lived in her chest for 3 years, the suffocating grief, the burning humiliation of being treated as invisible finally shattered and dissolved. Her lungs expanded, drawing in a long, deep breath of cold, clean air. Her heart settled into a slow, steady, triumphant rhythm. She had promised herself she would not break, and she had not. She had taken the fire of her pain and forged it into a blade, and she had just watched it cut down the people who murdered her husband. Vanessa, sobbing hysterically on the marble floor, lifted her head. She looked at Clara. The pure, agonizing humiliation in Vanessa's eyes was absolute. She was a broken, ruined woman, crying at the feet of the person she had considered trash. "Are you happy now?" Vanessa screamed, her voice a ragged, ugly shriek that echoed off the glass walls. "You ruined my life. You took everything from me." Clara looked down at the ruined bride. Her posture remained flawless. Her expression was the epitome of devastating calm. "I did not take anything, Miss Sterling," Clara said quietly. Her voice was smooth, elegant, and entirely untouchable. "I simply returned what was yours." Clara did not wait for a response. She did not need to see the security guards moving in to escort the screaming bride and her panicked father out of the building. She did not need to hear the chaotic whispers of the elite crowd, watching a dynasty collapse in real time. She turned around. The guests, the same billionaires and socialites who had laughed at her and dismissed her, immediately parted like the sea. They stepped back, pressing themselves against the floral arches to give her a wide, respectful path. They looked at her not with pity, but with a profound, terrified awe. Clara Hayes walked back down the long, white runner. The sharp, rhythmic click of her heels against the marble was the only sound she focused on. She walked past the empty chairs, past the scattered white rose petals, toward the heavy oak doors leading out of the conservatory. The sunlight hit the sharp angles of her face, illuminating a woman who had walked into the darkness with nothing, and walked out holding the entire world in her hands. She pushed the doors open and stepped out into the crisp, cold air of the coast. The ocean breeze caught the edge of her dark dress, billowing it behind her like a shadow. She did not look back. Inside the glass hall, Julian Vance stood at the altar, watching her disappear into the light. He knew he would never forget the woman in the black dress, the invisible archivist who had taught the master of the board what power truly looked like. Clara walked down the long, sweeping driveway of the Vanguard estate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silver tension wrench she had kept from Arthur's old drafting kit. She ran her thumb over the cold metal, a soft, genuine smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. The foundation was secure. The house belonged to the architect once again.